Okay, so without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Paul Herbert. He is the Executive Director of the 1st Division Museum at Cantigny. A 1972 USAMA grad, he served a long and distinguished career in the U.S. Army, retiring with the rank of colonel. He also holds a PhD from The Ohio State University in military history and held numerous command, staff, and academic posts in the U.S. Army. And we are delighted to be working with him once again. He is the author of Deciding What Is to Be Done, General William E. Dupuy, and the writing of Field Manual 100-5, Operations 1976. Paul, thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. I suppose this is not the time to confess my admiration for Woodrow Wilson, John J. Pershing, and Douglas MacArthur. I don't know how many more of these conferences we want to do. Anyway, I want to thank all three of my distinguished colleagues who preceded me for setting the table so thoroughly and well about America's involvement in World War I and our strategic approach and the performance on the Western Front. And you all should share in that appreciation, because it cuts at least 20 minutes out of what I was going to say, and we can turn that maybe into a longer break. But beware, if I don't use up all my time just sort of rattling on here, I hope that we can do a practical exercise, which I'm sure will stimulate all of you. So I will do the best I can. I'm going to talk about the Battle of Cantigny. By the way, it's Cantigny. It's not Cantigny. If you go to France, it's Cantigny. We can't make Midwesterners say that, so we force them to say Cantigny as opposed to what they're inclined to say, which is Cantigny. It kind of drives us all crazy, right? So let me say a little bit about that. Our benefactor was the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, who owned and published the Tribune for almost 50 years, and he lived here on this estate. And when he came back from his own distinguished service in World War I, as the commander of an artillery battalion in America's 1st Division, now the 1st Infantry Division, he renamed this state Cantigny in commemoration of the battle. And that was America's first battle. That was the first one we fought in World War I, from the 28th to the 31st of May, 1918. And so that explains our interest in both the Battle of Cantigny and the history of the 1st Division. And despite that bias, having spent a little bit of time looking at this battle, I think the Battle of Cantigny specifically, World War I more generally, but the Battle of Cantigny specifically marks a very important transition point in the history of America's military strategy and the history of the American Army. And I have boldly entitled this talk, The Battle of Cantigny and the Dawn of the Modern American Army. And I'll explain why I think that is so. For those of you who have short memories or snooze during my talk, I've provided you with two articles that I wrote several years ago that lay out the argument. I've also given you a paper copy of my slides, so if you want to follow on along those and jot your notes down, please feel welcome to do so. Okay, next slide. So I pose this important, maybe I can do it, academic question. What the heck is a division, and why should I care? Well, the definition is right there. Now, where does it say that? I wrote it. Now, I cobbled together a bunch of things, including a paraphrase of a definition I found on the world's most authoritative source, which is Wikipedia, but also Field Service Regulations 1905 of the American Army and a number of other sources, and then I kind of played with it, and that's what I said. It's a subcomponent of an army. It's permanently established. It's a major combat formation. It's not a supporting formation. It has a fixed chain of command, so it's generals and colonels who run it. They're always there, or those positions are always there, and you can move other units in and out of a division as you need to. And it has sufficient assets, usually combined arms, to fight independent actions on its own. And it in fact is a military manifestation of modernity, at least modernity is defined by the Industrial Revolution. And we come to it very late. The French organized their army into permanently standing divisions in 1789. The United States does it for World War I in 1917. Now, to the second part, why should I care? Well, you're here spending a weekend at a military history seminar. So for crying out loud, by definition, you should care. But also, I think the transition of the American Army from a constabulary and frontier policing force of not regiments, they were organized in regiments on paper, but they were in fact serving in scattered detachments all over the world and along the frontier, to divisions, marks an intention to play a role internationally, militarily, that we had thus far eschewed in our history. Okay, next slide. Or I can do it. There we go. So we're going to find the roots of the 1st Division in 338 BC. I'm sure that'll come as a surprise to most people who've served in the 1st Infantry Division. First we're going to talk about the challenge of combined arms. Now, this is almost intuitive. It is a military advantage if you can bring to bear against your enemy a combination of threats or weapon systems. And that idea is as old as human conflict. Consider a boxer who jabs with his left and punches with his right. Consider the offensive the offensive team of any football team that puts together an offensive line, a quarterback, running backs, ends, receivers, so on and so forth, right, in different combinations in order to razzle-dazzle their opponent. Or two wrestlers who grapple each other in a number of different ways to move the center of gravity of their opponent. So it's intuitive, and in warfare, it has always been the case that we try to bring together more than one way of bringing violence against our enemy. And so we're going to talk about that through the Gunpowder Revolution, the French Revolution, the wars of Napoleon, very, very briefly. So here's Philip II of Macedon. And here's a battle that he fought that was very important in ancient Greek history. And here are the Macedonians and his son Alexander, who becomes Alexander the Great, and who modifies the military system invented by his father to conquer the known world at the time. And all this is infantry and cavalry. The infantry is armed with spears, quite frankly. As a matter of fact, they were a modified spear called a sarissa. And the cavalry is horse-mounted, such as this picture right here. And the idea is that you use your infantry and your cavalry in some clever combination of ways that destroys the enemy army. And in this case, by a clever repositioning of his infantry, when the enemy infantry attacked, he was able to render to them a vulnerability on their right flank, and his cavalry attacked into that space, which is indicated here, and was able to split the enemy army apart and destroy it in detail. So it's a clear example of the use of combined arms on a battlefield, in this case, infantry and artillery. So let's jump forward 1,000 years into Europe at the Battle of Crecy, where the French and the English are at it yet again as part of the 100 Years' War. And in this particular case, this is the Middle Ages. Battlefields are dominated by the mounted knight principally, but also by the feudal hordes of infantry, very poorly trained, very crudely equipped. But the English brought something new to the battlefield, and that was archers. You see the archers here. And so they selected a really good piece of terrain, and they let the French, particularly the French knights, approach them. And I forget the statistics, but the statistics are absolutely amazing of how many arrows the English bowmen were able to launch. And oh, by the way, because the English longbow was so powerful, and because they had figured out how to make a metal arrowhead, these are armor-piercing arrows. When they're launched into the air and they come down at the same velocity by which they went up, they will go through the thinner armor on top of a mounted knight or his horse. And they are fired by the tens of thousands. And in spaces between the violent clashes of these two armies, English soldiers could be seen running out onto the battlefield and recovering the arrows and bringing them back to the archers. So the point of the matter is now you're trying to combine an indirect, I'll call it fire, an indirect shooting system, bows, with standard infantry, which has things that look like halberds and spears and swords and things like that, and the heavy mounted knight. And in fact, this battle is pretty much the end of the heavy mounted knight's dominance, and it heralds a time when masses of organized infantry can start to compete militarily with the power of the mounted knight. The father of modern warfare is Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, who in the 30 Years' War of the 17th century organizes his army, and now he's using gunpowder technologies because the gunpowder revolution has taken hold in Europe. And so the Battle of Breitenfeld is a tremendous example, and we won't go into all the details. We'll just show that when the enemy army tries to do what almost all armies have tried to do for millennia, and to some degree still try to do in ground combat, when they try to envelop a flank, to get on the vulnerable flank of their opponent, because of the articulation that is possible with the training of the Swedish army, Gustavus can respond to that more quickly than his opponent. And so he repositions units that he calls battalions, and in fact addresses that threat, then realizes that by making that move, they themselves have opened up a left flank, and launches his cavalry in this manner to come in behind the enemy army and destroy it. So what you're looking for is the synchronized use of multiple means on a battlefield. That's what you're trying to achieve. And of course, gunpowder weapons are very, very new in 1631. So the muskets have a very low rate of fire. They are very inaccurate. They take a very long time to reload. The cannons that exist are deadly, but also inaccurate and so big and heavy that they're almost impossible to move around the battlefield. And so achieving this kind of mobility is really quite an achievement, but there are still real technological limitations to how rapidly you can move killing power around on a battlefield. The French Revolution changes that. The French Revolution mobilizes the people of France. And so the French can produce a huge army compared to all of their European opponents. The problem is that it's practically a rabble in arms. These folks are ideologically committed, patriotically fervent, but have no military experience themselves, and the numbers are so large that the existing officer corps is really, really challenged to give them the training that they need in the older style, very rigid drill style that characterized armies of the 18th century. So they develop a tactic called the ordre mixte. And the ordre mixte combines, despite the presence of gunpowder weapons, the ordre mixte combines column formations with the linear formations that are essential to musket-armed armies. And a column formation, if you line everybody up in a long column like this, and you've got really brave, tough guys at the front, and you say, "Go get them, guys," and everybody runs, okay, the people in the back don't have to be as well drilled, and you have a really powerful offensive arm. Now, that oversimplifies the case entirely, but I'm trying to get the 1917, so bear with me here. Okay. The other thing the French are able to do is they figure out how to lighten their artillery so that the cannons can be moved around the battlefield kind of at the same pace as the infantry using combined formations and the cavalry. So now you have all three arms, cavalry, infantry, and artillery, that are somewhat mobile. That allows the French army to organize their army into divisions. A division is roughly 10, 12, 15,000 soldiers. And those formations are permanently standing formations of combined arms. Each one of them has infantry, artillery, cavalry, working for a single general, and that general can take that unit and perform independent action on a battlefield. So we now have a much wider span of control because the general commanding the army doesn't have to tell every single regiment what it's supposed to do. He can give a mission to this division commander and say, you go block that pass, you run around there and get on the flank, you protect our rear, and you 5 other divisions come with me, we're the main attack and we're going to do this. Okay? So you get an opportunity for much more sophisticated combat. This is put to deadly use through the genius and brilliance of Napoleon Bonaparte. And here's a typical Napoleonic battle before he was emperor. This is during the still during the Revolutionary period, but this is the Battle of Rivoli, which is in northern Italy, and the results of it are that the French beat the Austrians and they add northern Italy to what will become the French Empire. But you can see the Austrian forces, this is all in mountains. Look at the painting here. See the steepness of the mountains and the passes and the draws. And there's this little plateau with a river on the right flank here where the French army is drawn up, and the Austrians are trying to come down by multiple passes. You'll see a unit of the Austrian army coming down here, and they're going to try and surround the French army and destroy it while distracting them with a frontal attack right here. And to make a long story short, Napoleon wards that off, and he wards that off because he has these divisions. Okay, he sends a division over here to stop these guys from crossing the river, and 2 divisions down here under Massena to stop this distraction attack back here. And part of Massena's army or corps is able to go up this mountain pass and confront these guys. And then he's able to recall those guys and mass on the battlefield on this on the plateau where the decisive action is actually happening and defeat that as well. Okay, and so it is his genius, but it is also the systematic combination of arms that gives him this incredible capability, and with it he reorganizes the entire French army and conquers all of Europe. So that's a pretty good achievement. So what about us? Well, we won't get into this in a great amount of detail. Suffice it to say that we fought the American Revolution with regiments that mimicked the French and the British, very small army, very few regular regiments in the Continental Line, and we also had hordes of militia. And there's been a ton written about that. Occasionally, we threw regiments together in bigger organizations that we called brigades and divisions, but it was a temporary expedient on the battlefield, and those organizations did not last. Certainly, they didn't last beyond the war. Oftentimes, they didn't last beyond the battle in case. But at West Point, which opened in 1802, everybody was mesmerized by Napoleon. And so Napoleon was studied intensely by all the cadets who went through West Point between 1802 and the opening of the American Civil War. And I'm going to talk in some detail about the American Civil War because in the American Civil War, we do have combined arms. We do have divisions. We do have corps. The American Army becomes extremely competent at big warfare during the American Civil War. The problem is when the war is over, we have no more need of it. Our concerns are on the frontier. And we disassemble that army, and we send it out to the frontier, and we essentially forget the lessons because there's no immediate threat. You know, we saw the quote earlier about the Atlantic Ocean, right? There's no immediate purpose to having a big army that is capable of fighting other armies. While we are policing the frontier and an early colonial empire, the Industrial Revolution is taking hold. And the next time that, as Jennifer so brilliantly painted, that we mobilize a lot of people for a big army, the technology that is available to us is completely different than anything that anybody in the U.S. Army has any experience with whatsoever. So let's look at the Civil War Army. It's organized into an army, and there's the Army of the Potomac, there's the Army of the Ohio, there's the Army of the Tennessee. As you read through, there's all these armies. Early in the war, they were subdivided in divisions, but it doesn't take us very long to organize them into corps. And each corps has 3 to 5 divisions. Each division has 3 to 5 brigades. Each brigade has 3 to 6 regiments of infantry, so on and so forth, okay? Now, what's not shown on this is that the divisions, what makes them a division, is that they also have their own artillery. So the commander of any one of those divisions can mix musket-armed infantry, and I should emphasize rifle musket-armed infantry by 1863, with artillery, okay? And then as you go up from brigade to division to corps to army, each of those commanders has more assets that he can integrate at any level onto the battlefield. This is part of a Union division moving through Winchester, Virginia in 1864. And you can see this is probably a brigade here of a couple of regiments, another one over here. The artillery is moving down this road. These guys have gotten off to the side of the road to let the artillery pass through. And then you can see here the sizes of these formations, okay? So let's just take the first one, First Corps. Number of officers, 949. Number of men, 14,000. Number of mules, 2,578, okay? These are big formations. It's hard to control that number of people, let alone to manipulate them in the chaos of battle in a way that makes logical sense from a military point of view in terms of the combination of arms. So that's what our Civil War armies look like. Let's look at the Battle of Gettysburg, which we all like to talk about. This portrays the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Union Army is on the defensive along Seminary Ridge. The Confederate Army, having failed in their attack on the right flank of the Union Army on day 1, is going to try the left flank on day 2. This will precipitate the famous stand at the Battle of Little Round Top. The only point that I want to make is, look at this mix of the spaghetti bowl mix of red and blue arrows. These are armies that can maneuver on the battlefield. They can move quickly. They can reposition. They can bring artillery over here. They can put artillery up there. They can fire artillery this way. They can bring another regiment up that way. So by 1863, there's a lot of what we would call tactical articulation that is possible in the Union Army. This is a painting of the Battle of Gettysburg on the third day at what is called the high tide of the Confederacy, where Pickett's charge goes toward the copse of trees and is barely repelled by the Union Army. And there's a couple of things I want to say about it. It is still the firing line. It is a linear line of soldiers standing pretty much shoulder to shoulder. They may be 2 or 3 ranks deep, okay? Because the weapon they have fires 1 round and then must be reloaded by the muzzle. And so in order to put a lot of killing power out to your front, you've got to line people up and teach them to fire in volleys. And that explains a great deal of the rigidity of drill and formations in armies up to this time. But it's the early Industrial Revolution, and we've learned how to rifle those muskets, and so the round that they fire is lethal at about 1,000 meters and is effective at about 250 meters. And so what that means is, unlike the smoothbore muskets where you couldn't kill your enemy until you were about 50 yards away from him, and then you could charge at the point of a bayonet and you wouldn't lose too many people, in this kind of fighting, as you're trying to close, you are crossing a killing field where your enemy can hit you and kill you for maybe 10 minutes as you cross that ground between the opposing armies. The other point I want to make is that artillery is still black powder, pretty much smooth bore. It is not repeating, and they haven't figured out how to pull the artillery back behind the firing line and shoot on an indirect trajectory over the heads of their friendly troops, okay? And so you can see they're rushing this cannon up to the front. You probably can't see it because this is washed out. But if you examine this painting, you'll see 1, 2, 3 cannons that are right up there on the infantry line. Okay, now they're deadly, but they are essentially supporting the fire of the infantry. This is the legacy that final point. The master of all this, and I don't say this just because I was born and raised in his hometown, is Ulysses S. Grant, okay? And this is the 1864 overland campaign between the wilderness battlefields across Virginia to Richmond, Petersburg, and Appomattox. And this is where Grant brings Robert E. Lee to his destruction and forces his surrender and ends the Civil War. There's much more to it, but the point that I want you to see is that this is about a 100-mile distance here. And look at all of this movement. These are Army corps that are moving, okay? Grant sits in his command post every night and writes orders to almost every corps and division commander in the Army, throws them in a box, gives them to his adjutant, and says, send these out tomorrow morning. He never scratches out anything. He never wrinkles one up and throws it away. No, that's not what I want to say. He's got it all up here. He writes it out. Do that. That's what we're doing tomorrow. And he just keeps outmaneuvering the Army in Northern Virginia, trying to get on its flank, bringing it to battle when he can. And this is a masterpiece. Despite the blunder of Cold Harbor, it is a masterpiece of the operational art, which is what we call the military science of employing very large land formations. But we forget all that, for the most part. We forget all that, because after 1865, we don't need it. And the first touch that we have of anything like it is the Mexican punitive expedition in 1916, where we're going to go into Mexico to find the terrorist, Pancho Villa, who has come into our homeland and threatened its security by committing acts of terror against the peaceful citizens of our country in places like Columbus, New Mexico. And by golly, we're going to get him. And the person who commands that expedition is Brigadier General John J. Pershing. And we go into the mountains of northern Mexico using the technology of aircraft, trucks, motorized logistics, machine guns, motorcycles, okay, dazzling stuff, searching for him. And we find his cohorts, and we even find him one time and we wound him. But he scampers away, and we never find him. We never bring him to bear. And eventually we settle diplomatically with the extant government of Mexico, and we withdraw our troops. Kind of interesting, right? In all those features, we can think of other times that we have chased a particular noxious terrorist enemy through mountains using high technology forces and trying to find them and not quite pulling it off in the manner that we would want to. At any rate, when we enter the war in 1917, General Pershing is the only officer in the Army who has commanded anything like a modern division. And he's done it in the wilds of northern Mexico against a guerrilla band. Now, why was World War I different? Well, there's a whole lot of reasons, okay? And you know that as well as I do. First of all, these armies fighting in Europe are huge. Jennifer made the point that the national mobilization for World War I was like nothing before in our history. Ditto Britain, ditto France, ditto Russia, ditto Germany. The German army that invades Belgium, which it's doing here in 1914, is 2 million soldiers just in that field army. These soldiers are equipped with weapons that very few people have much experience with at all. They've been used a little bit in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and there are indications of what it might mean. But the first thing is that you have automatic weapons like this German machine gun. And those things can fire, I forget the rates of fire, you can look them up, but they are thousands of rounds a minute. And so now a single machine gun crew like these German soldiers here have the killing power of 3 or 4 Union Army regiments. That's 5 guys. Okay? And we have hundreds of these machine guns in every division. And the 2 million soldiers are divided by a German division is about 12 or 13,000 soldiers. So we have hundreds of divisions with maybe not hundreds, let's say dozens of machine guns. Every soldier has a repeating rifle. In other words, he does not have to load it from the muzzle 1 round at a time. As fast as he can manipulate, in this case, the bolt action back here, he can fire another well-aimed round. Bang, 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 like that. So the killing power of these formations, and that weapon is accurate out to 500 or 700 meters. Okay? And they have figured out how to have more accurate, rifled, breech-loading artillery. In this case, the Model 1897 75-millimeter gun, which is the primary artillery piece that the American Army will be armed with when it enters World War I. All right? So, this gun, okay, usually is used in a line-of-sight manner. What that means is you can see your target. It's way the heck and gone over there, and you can bring accurate fire to bear on it. It is rifled. It uses high explosive powder, not the black powder of the Civil War. Okay, and it has this thing under here. Okay, is a pneumatic recoil mechanism. So when this gun fires, these wheels don't jerk back 10 or 15 yards like a Civil War cannon would. Okay, and then you have to go get the cannon and roll it back into position. The carriage stays stationary. And so if you can see that your first round has landed on your target, you just keep the barrel in that position and fire these guns as fast as you possibly can. And so you can bring a terrible amount of firepower to the battlefield. The combination of these kinds of weapons in every division means that a division is extremely difficult to destroy. That business of getting on its flank, it probably isn't going to help, because if he can get 6 or 7 machine gun crews over there, he can stop you. If he can aim a little bit of his artillery over there, he can stop you. And none of these infantry divisions in Europe have a mobility advantage against the other. They all move at about the same space, or about the same pace. So if you see that your enemy is trying to move on your flank, by the time he gets there, you can have repositioned some of these weapons. And so it is very, very difficult to get a battle of annihilation against any part of an enemy army. Now, I mentioned that these armies are big, okay? This is the Western Front, what many of us have shown it, as it becomes stabilized by about 1916 or so. But in 1914, okay, after the miracle of the Marne, which protects Paris, which is right here, the French, British, and German armies try to outflank each other, and because they can't, in head-on-head combat, they can't destroy each other because of the defensive power of all of these weapons and their large numbers. So now what they try to do is get on each other's flanks, and it's called the race to the sea. And look at it. You can just see the dates. Okay, I go there, he goes there, I go here, I go there. Beep, 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 and where do they end up? They end up at the English Channel. All right? And so people say, well, why was there a Western Front? There was a Western Front because these huge and very difficult to destroy armies filled up all of the available space between mountainous and neutral Switzerland and the English Channel. And after the race to the sea, depicted here, you have this continuous front. Everybody dug in because the only way to avoid the lethality of these systems is to dig a hole, which becomes a trench, which becomes a system of trenches, which becomes concrete bunkers. And now, it doesn't matter how smart a person may be. There is one problem that you have to solve. How do you get up out of your trenches, across no man's land, break through his trenches far enough to drag your artillery and your supplies with you and get into open, meaning non-entrenched ground in his rear, and do lethal damage to him. And every general from 1915 to the end of the war is trying to figure out how to solve that problem. And that's why we invent poisonous gas. That's why we invent tanks. That's why we invent the underground mines. Somebody, I think Doug, talked about Vauquois today, where they dug under this butte and tried to blow up the trenches. Everything else is trying to solve the problem of the deadlocked Western Front. On the Western Front, the Eastern Front was different to some degree. The Italian Front was different, but this is the problem. Okay. Now, into that mix comes the 1st Division. The 1st Division is called the 1st Division because it was America's 1st Division. What are your questions? Okay. Other speakers have already painted the picture. Russia drops out in 1917. The Germans can move 200 divisions from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. We're in the war, but we don't have an army that anybody respects. So the Germans decide they think they've got a tactical solution to how we break the Western Front. And what they decide is we've got to use this momentary opportunity of having all these Eastern Front divisions and the Americans not here yet, and the French army mutinies in 1917, you may recall. And the Germans say, we have to win it all before the Americans can get over here, because if they're serious and they bring everything they've got over here, we've probably had it. And so they invent the Ludendorff Offensive of the spring of 1918. Now, before that happens, the French and the British, once we declare war in April 1917, send a delegation to see that evil man, President Wilson, who all of us have learned to not like. And they say, Mr. President, we have a real no kidding crisis. And you need to get American troops into this war immediately. Our armies are mutinying. We're out of gas. This, that, and the other. The Germans are bringing their stuff over from the Eastern Front. Help, 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 help. And, with sublime rhetoric, President Wilson says, and this is April, I'll have a division in France by June. You will? Yes. And the rest of the army will follow shortly. Oh, thank you so much. And they leave overjoyed, right, by this news. Now, this part I'm making up. It's not historical, okay? It's just Herbert's imagination, so don't tell your students this. But you can imagine Secretary of War Newton Baker walking up to the president after this meeting and saying, Mr. President, pardon me, but you just told these gentlemen that we'd have a division in France in 2 months. I just wanted to remind you that we don't have any divisions. We only have regiments, and they're all in Mexico. And I just wanted to sort of paint that picture for you. To which I'm sure Mr. President, or Mr. Wilson, good executive that he is, said, Mr. Secretary, this is not my problem. Now, shortly thereafter, okay, the telegrams go from the War Department to our headquarters at San Antonio, Texas. And they say, May 24th, 1917, pick 4 regiments of infantry, 2 of artillery, put them on the trains and get them to Hoboken, New Jersey immediately. They are going to France. So General Pershing picks 4 regiments that he had high confidence in: the 16th Infantry Regiment, the 18th Infantry Regiment, the 26th Infantry Regiment, the 28th Infantry Regiment, the 5th Field Artillery, and the 6th Field Artillery. Loads them up on trains and sends them to Hoboken. As those steam trains stop in whistle stops all across America to re-water and re-coal and let the troops stretch their legs a little bit, the sergeants go out into those little towns and say, any of you young fellows want to go to France with us, want to join the army? And lots of guys do, because if you heard where Alvin York was hanging out just before the war, right, this sounds like a big adventure. And so they hop on. They don't have a weapon, a uniform, Okay, they haven't been enrolled into the United States Army. They haven't taken the oath. They have not been trained, but they're part of the 1st Division, and off they go to Hoboken. Their general, Major General Siebert, arrives there on June 8th, 1917. On June 10th, they load the ships, and on June 26th, for the first time in history, American soldiers land on the continent of Europe to take on the mightiest military power in history up till that time, the Imperial German Army. And that's the 1st Division. Now, the 1st Division didn't fight World War I or any other war all by itself, despite the impression you may get when you walk through our main exhibit gallery. It was the first of 42 divisions that we sent to France. 42. And someone has already made the point that our divisions are bigger. They are 27,000 soldiers. 42 times 27,000. That's big. But we don't have them like that. This is just the first one. The first one goes, and we got to do all the other stuff that other speakers have talked about to organize these divisions. And when you're putting this division together, what you're trying to do is put together a permanent, combined arms, combat formation capable of independent action on its own. And so you get something that looks like this. It's the only wiring diagram I will show. Okay? And it's wrong, oh, by the way. It shows, I think, that the regiments had 2 battalions, and in fact, the regiments had 3 battalions, and I apologize for that mistake. I could say much more about this, but we'll move on. So the Ludendorff offensives in the spring of 1918, this is the Germans' big chance to end the war before we can make a difference. That's what they're trying to do. And the first one is depicted right here, and it breaks, Jennifer made this point, it breaks the Western Front. It gets into the open, unentrenched ground behind the Allied lines. It practices the open warfare that Pershing was trying to make the American Army learn, because he also realized that we can't concentrate solely on the problem of breaking the trenches, because breaking the trenches by itself doesn't win the war. You've got to get into the enemy's rear and maneuver. The Germans do that, and it creates a huge crisis. They go 40 miles in a couple of days. They're threatening Paris. Everybody's hair is on fire. Okay, and Pershing, who is supposed to be organizing what, according to the president's policy? A what kind of army? Anybody know? American? Another adjective. Independent. An independent American army to have an independent military presence on the battlefield so that the American president, when we come to the peace negotiations, has some oomph behind him. Well, Pershing's got 4 divisions, only one of which, the first, has finished its training. And he sends it to the point of that offensive to a tiny little village which is right there, 75 miles north of Paris, and the name of that place is Cantigny. And that's where America's first battle will be fought. So, you have in front of you somewhere a document that looks like this. How much time do I have? How much time do I have? Okay, perfect. All right. So, a big story that I'm not going to go into. Okay, the Germans shift the main point of their attack shortly after the 1st Division arrives at this crisis spot in April of 1918. Okay? And a big counterattack had been planned. The 1st Division is part of the French army. But when the Germans shift the focal point of their offensives, as you can see, as you saw by the other shaded areas on the map, that counterattack is no longer needed with the power that had been planned. But the Americans want to get into this fight. And so this guy, Robert Bullard, who's the commanding general of the 1st Division, and this person, Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall, who's the operations officer. Yes, he is the same guy who will be Chief of Staff of the Army in World War II, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Marshall Plan. That guy, he's a 1st Division officer. And they are going to plan a division-sized counterattack. And that attack is depicted here, and it is captured in Field Order 18, dated 20 May 1918, 1st Division Field Order 18. You have one tiny selection of it. The actual complete order is about yay thick. And I was going to bring that up here, and we were going to work on it for the rest of the weekend. And my FPRI colleagues said, no, you can't do that. And so I shrunk it down, all right? I think this is an extremely important primary source in American military history. Because in the same way that Jennifer told us that America had never tried before to mobilize on the scale of World War I, until that order was published, no modern American division had ever been ordered into battle in the manner that they must be ordered into battle on a World War I battlefield. And if you could bring an officer out of the Civil War and have him read this order, I think he would be stunned. He wouldn't know exactly how to understand it. I think if my friend Major Nathan Finney, sitting back there, who has joined us from the Command and General Staff College, were to look at this order, he would recognize in it the same elements by which our soldiers have been ordered into battle in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is truly a turning point in American military history. And what I want you to do is I want you to imagine yourself being George Marshall, class of 1903 from the Virginia Military Institute, who has only served in combat in the Philippines against guerrillas, who now has placed on his shoulders the burden of articulating how we are going to bring to bear against the German army all of the materials that are now in our hands. Okay, so here's what I want you to do with this order. I want everybody to read the first 5 pages, because that is the basic order. That's what we call the basic order. So what a basic order does is it lays out the plan, okay? And then there are annexes that fill in details according to functional areas. So you might have an intelligence annex that tells you all the details about the enemy situation, a fire support annex that tells you how the artillery is going to work, that a logistical annex that tells you how we're going to supply this plan, an engineer annex that says here are all the particular things an engineer is going to try to do. So take some time, and you don't have to read it in detail, but zip through it. Okay, and then I'm going to break you into a couple of groups. I can't walk away from here. Okay, we're going to take like the first half dozen people, first 6 people right over here. And I want you to look at the liaison annex, which is about halfway into your packet. So find annex, I think it's 9, I don't know, because I really don't prepare for class, I just wing it. It's Annex 9, Annex 9 Liaison. So you 6 people are going to read that, and the first page after the basic order, which is the first 5 pages, is a sketch that should have been in Annex 9. Okay, the next... Now let's make that 8 people. 3, 6, 8. Okay, so then we're going to take the next 8 folks, however many that is, and I don't care if the fuzzy boundaries, whatever you work on. The next group is going to work on the supply annex, and I also want you looking at the soldier load page. There's a single page in there on what soldiers are supposed to carry. The whole back row here, there's an annex in there on tanks. It's Annex 7. Find Annex 7 titled Tanks and read it. And then the first half coming toward me of this roll, I want you to find everything you can find in that document about aviation. Just flip through it and read any time that aviation or things that fly are mentioned. I want you to find that and read it. And then finally, coming toward me the rest of this way, I want you to read the very last page. Now, here are the questions that I want you to think about while you're doing this. You can think about anything you want. But put it in the context of what I just told you, which is the fundamental military problem we're trying to solve here is the synchronization of multiple arms to bring a maximum amount of violence against our opponent on a World War I battlefield. How are we going to do that? Who's going to do what? And how are we going to put the whole thing together? Jennifer mentioned this. She said it's a puzzle piece. You have to put the puzzle together, okay? I want you to look for evidence in this document that we're talking about the 20th century, not the 19th century. What distinguishes this from a Civil War battlefield? Because the two are not the same. And there's a tendency, quite frankly, in the great American public, and particularly among young kids, and sometimes among us, to see war as all the same thing. It's red and blue lines on a map and a mob of guys out there trying to kill each other, because the same thing that excites them about the NCAA playoffs excites them about the prospect of the ultimate competition of war. And that it's all just craziness. What distinguishes this from the 19th century? How are they synchronizing the fight? What is it going to take to synchronize this effort? What problems do you think they're going to encounter? And here's a great question. Given those problems, what inventions do you think need to be developed? Not pie in the sky stuff, but what has yet to be invented that would solve some of those problems? Now, I want you to look at it from that perspective, and let's take 5 minutes to peruse it with those questions, and then I'll be glad to handle questions, but I would also like you to nominate answers to the things that I've posed and to what you see in this order. Okay, so I know that's a completely inadequate amount of time to do what I've asked you to do, which is exactly how your students feel many times during the course of a year. So let's go to the graded discussion. So what do you think? From that very cursory examination of this paper, what's it tell you? Don't all speak at once. Remember to push the little button. Yes, sir.
Yes, we were impressed by how many different methods of communications that they had to use. They're using pigeons, they're using field telephones, optics, et cetera, and it goes on with all these different, not very efficient systems. And of course, all this would be made better if the radios were actually portable. They have a few radios in the mix here, but they're obviously big, heavy things that can't go much of anywhere.
Yeah, terrific point. Did you all see? Can anybody talk about likely problems of communication? We were talking about one right back here, yeah.
They had two runners assigned to different units as the tanks were advancing, and they had to be American runners who spoke French, which I would think would be a hazardous job as tanks are advancing through the front lines.
It's a terribly hazardous job, and when you go through the Cantigny gallery, you can look for, we had two French guys and two American guys, right? Now, why do you need runners alongside of the tank? Why do that? Huh? Back to your point.
They have no radios in the tanks.
Have no radios. Okay, so how are you going to get tanks to work in concert with the infantry? All right, on a smoke-filled battlefield, chaotic artillery going off, machine gun fire all over the place, et cetera, et cetera. So communications is a huge issue. Any other issues of modernity here? Yeah.
Oh, well, one thing that our group had noticed was one of the movements was H minus 3 minutes, and you had a certain time you had to synchronize your watches. Well, what if your watch is 3 minutes off or 30 seconds off? Just the mere timing.
Yeah.
Was something that amazed us.
Yeah, okay. So the watch is a new invention. You know, a relatively new invention. Now, we had pocket watches in the railroads in the late 19th century. We all know that, right? But a rugged watch that a soldier can take out onto a battlefield, carry with him 24/7 in all kinds of weather and conditions and dirt and all that. So how do they all know that it's the same time?
It said there was a time for synchronization.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know.
At this particular time,
They said they would use reliable watches.
Yeah. Huh? They first of all use reliable watches, but what are they going to do with the watches? Did anybody get that in the last page of the order? Yeah, sometimes they fired a gun. If you can imagine, this is a battlefield. My signal for 3 o'clock is I'll fire my gun.
And the officers have to deliver
Great, Captain.
time. They have to
Yeah.
deliver the time.
Yeah, okay, so they have a bunch of watches at division headquarters. They get them all ticking to the same time, and then they take all but 2 of them to the brigade headquarters, and they set the brigade. Okay, but it is, if you're going to do, now I haven't talked about this, but this diagram is the rolling barrage. This is the infantry all lined up to assault, to go over the top, out of the trenches, okay? And ahead of them, because Jennifer mentioned that the coordination of infantry with indirect fire artillery is one of the big problems. And when you have a set-piece battle like Cantigny, they had weeks to prepare this, okay? And it's a single regiment of the 1st Division. You can plan a rolling barrage where the artillery fires on that line until this time, and then all the guns move forward to this line, and then this line, and then this line, and this line, and that is at a pace at which an infantryman can walk behind it. Okay? And that's how you coordinate. And so that artillery fire keeps the defender in his hole and his head down, and he's unable to man his machine gun and his rifles and his other deadly weapons. And when the artillery rolls across the objective, the infantry is right there and can kill him while he's still in his trenches and dugouts. Okay? Does it work? The answer is yes, kinda. What's the problem? Yeah.
Well, I'd see a big problem is what happened if they missed their targets or the gunners did make it too, and maybe some of your infantrymen are killed, or just everything else, like I said, could be thrown out of chaos. The timing, even if they're halted a little bit, would throw everything off.
Yeah, exactly. If anywhere along the infantry line anything happens to any group of infantry, they've got no way of having that rolling barrage not move away from them, right? Which makes them more vulnerable. So that core, and then if you think about open warfare, let's say that you're successful in this attack and breaking through the enemy's defenses, which would be entirely theoretical, but let's just say you do it and you get into the enemy's rear and you're now going to start to maneuver like Grant maneuvered in Virginia, okay? You've got to move your guns, and the guns have to know where the infantry is in order for them to fire and not kill their own guys. And that whole system, and we have to do it with the communications that we've just identified are pretty faulty and work best when we're in a static position, not moving. Because what's our principal means of communication? Pardon? I can't hear you. Well, runners is most reliable, okay? Yeah, but it's what? It's field telephones, wire telephones, okay? And that's what that big complicated spider web diagram is in the order. Okay, now who has to lay those wires out? Soldiers. And what happens when the enemy starts to fire his artillery? It breaks the wire. What happens when your command post has to move forward? Breaks the wire. Or you can't talk to anybody until you lay another wire. I don't know if you found it, but there's a point where they say, okay, we'll have runner stations, a system of runners will parallel the telephone lines, and there'll be a system of runner outposts, and the runner outposts can't be closer together than 500 meters, and at every outpost, every message will be copied in full before it is given to a runner and sent to the next outpost 500 meters away. You got to be kidding me. Okay? But they don't have the technology to do exactly what they're trying to do. Okay? All right. Other indications, besides the communications coordination thing, other problems that you can see with this plan? We got airplanes. What else have we got that flies? We got a balloon, right? Did you see the part where what's the balloon for? Yeah, why does a balloon help you command? You can get up where you can see the whole battlefield, right? So you can see we got a problem on the left flank, but the right flank is moving fine. The tanks are stuck. We got to do something about it. Then they got a telephone line from the guy in the basket of the balloon that goes down to the anchor point on the ground, and what's there? A motorcycle. So he can say, we got a problem on the left flank. Roger, we got a problem on the left flank. And off he goes across the battlefield to tell the division headquarters, we got a problem on the left flank. What's the problem? I don't know. I'll go back and ask. Okay. Now, what other kind of things have we got that fly? Pigeons, okay? We got Chaeronea and his cousins. And so we're still using pigeons. We also, both us and the other side, have fighter planes. Okay, so if you're going to put somebody up in a balloon, you're going to have to protect the balloon. And the enemy's going to try and take it out. Because that balloon is a whole lot more important than the typical high ground that we look for. This is real high ground, right? Okay, so I won't belabor this point anymore. The point that I want to make, and this is why I have, whatever I may think about other people we've discussed today, I have tremendous admiration for George C. Marshall. Because when he sits down outside Cantigny, France in May of 1918, and he's been ordered to launch this attack, he has to pull this together for the first time in American history. Now, they've trained with it before. They've experimented. They've learned from the French. It's not like it's with a blank sheet of paper. They've got a lot, and they've got French advisors helping them. But an American division had never been sent into combat before, organized and equipped as this one has, and nobody had ever tried to solve these problems before. And so on Jennifer's balance sheet of what went right and what went wrong, I think George C. Marshall came up with a respectable plan, even if he didn't have everything at hand that would have made this work more quickly or more readily. Now, some other things about the Battle of Cantigny. Our British and French allies hope and expect that it will fail. The Germans hope and expect that it will fail. We know why the Germans would hope and expect it would fail. They're the enemy, and their propaganda up to this point has stated boldly that the Americans can't fight. That's propaganda directed at their own people and their own army. The Americans can't fight. We don't have to worry about them. They're a bunch of country yokels. They're stupid. They're mixed race. They're multicultural. Okay? Whatever, and so that's the German line. Why are the British and French hoping that we'd fail? Yeah. Use your mic. Sorry. They wanted amalgamation. Remember that? They wanted amalgamation. The Battle of Cantigny ends the amalgamation discussion because the United States Army demonstrates that it can field a division, a modern division, send it into battle, and have it succeed. Because, in fact, we do take the village of Cantigny. More than that, won't talk about it here. It's not the attack that's the big deal at Cantigny. It's the defense over the next 3 days against vicious German counterattacks, and the 1st Division holds against that. Not all glory to the 1st Division. The next week, the 2nd Infantry Division and the 3rd Infantry Division are thrown into the crisis situation outside of Paris, 2nd Battle of the Marne that somebody else has mentioned here, and they hold, and they counterattack successfully, aided and abetted by the 5th and 6th Regiments of the United States Marines. And by the end of the last week of May and the first 2 weeks of June, it is clear as a bell that Americans can fight. They can fight on a modern battlefield. They can take on the world's greatest military power, Imperial Germany, and there are 2 million Americans on their way to Europe and another 2 million being trained behind them. And it's pretty clear how this war is going to go one way or another. And that is the significance of the Battle of Cantigny, America's first modern divisional combat. These are 1st Division soldiers going over the top, out of the trenches into the fight. Here are the French tanks that accompany them. I don't see the runners. This is a French flamethrower team in the village, clearing out the dugouts and bunkers. You can see the damage of the artillery preparation. You can see more French flamethrower guys working here. This is how a veteran remembered it 10 years after the battle. We have a whole book of these cartoons called Happy Days. And they are humorous, but to some degree sardonic about his memories as a soldier in the 1st Division. This is really cool because it is an aerial photograph of American infantry and French tanks maneuvering together on a battlefield at Cantigny. No photograph like that was possible at any point before this picture was taken. There are always casualties, and here's an aid station treating the casualties. There are German prisoners that are captured. There's a plan in your order for how we're going to handle the prisoners, because all those things have to be anticipated. It was the first battle. The 1st Division went on to fight at Soissons, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne through the rest of 1918, and a distinguished record in every war America has fought since, except the Korean War when they were still on occupation duty in Germany. Next year, we will celebrate a century of service. 100 years, not one day of which have we not been served by the men and women of the Big Red One. It is a distinguished legacy. And the other thing I would say about it is in every one of these fights, what the United States Army deployed were divisions. Infantry divisions, armor divisions, airborne divisions. That's how we have organized our Army for 100 years. And it is in part due to the success of George C. Marshall and the 1st Division at the Battle of Cantigny. Thank you for your attention.